Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this video, we'll be discussing about one of the most frequently asked interview questions, which is what is the difference between normal JavaScript functions and arrow functions. Let's take a look at it now. The most fundamental difference between both these types of functions is that arrow functions are not constructible, whereas other JS functions are actually constructible. We can simply see in this console example that if I try to use new keyword with arrow functions, we get a following error. And the error actually says the arrow function is not a constructor. Now we are done with this particular example. Let's focus on the second difference, the second fundamental difference, which is where does the this point to inside arrow functions? Well, to answer the previous question, I always remember this rule of thumb that the this present inside the arrow function always points to the this that is part of the current lexical scope. That's it. Let's take a look at the following examples to understand it further. So let's take a look at our first example. I've created a simple function. I've immediately invoked it. I've also created an arrow function. I've also immediately invoked it. If I remember the rule, the this that is present inside the arrow function will point towards the this that is part of the current lexical scope, which in this case is a window object. Now, if I try to run this particular snippet, you can see both the functions, console log, window object. Let's move on to the second example now. So let's take a look at our second example. I've created an object and it has two functions. First one is normal function, second one is arrow function. And let's analyze which console log will print what value. So if you think about this console log, it will print this object, because this function is actually binded to this object's property called func. And since this arrow function is part of the lexical scope of this particular function, this will also point to this particular object. Now, what about this arrow function? This arrow function will look at the lexical scope to which this particular object belongs to. And since the lexical scope in this scenario is global this, which is a window object, so this will actually console log window. Let's write it down. So window obj. Now let's try to run this. And we got it right. This points to obj, this also points to obj, and this points to window. You might be getting a little bit confused now, but we have another example coming up that will clear your doubts. Let's move on to the third example now. So in this example, I've simply copy pasted the previous example inside an outer function. And now let's analyze what will this point to in each and every console log. So at line number 2, if I simply call this function, this will point to window object, because that is the actual value of this inside this particular lexical scope. And this at line number 5 will point to object, because this function is actually binded to this property. And this inside this particular arrow function will also point to this object, because the parent lexical scope points to this object. Now this arrow function will point to window object, because this outer function scope points to window object. Let's try to run it now. So I'll simply call this function and run it. So you see we have these examples. The first console log points to window, second and third point to the object, and the last one, which is an arrow function, points to window. Now I'll simply do one change here, and that change would be I'll add new before outer function. Now what this will do is that it will create a new function, new object for this particular function using this particular function, and this then would not point to window but will point to the newly created object. And since you remember the rule, this present inside this arrow function will point to the this that is actually part of the current lexical scope, which in this particular scenario is the object created using outer function. Let's run this particular example and verify that. So if I run this, you see the first console log is outer function, the second and third are again objects, and the third one is again outer function. So I think this example might have cleared all your doubts regarding the where does the this point to an arrow function. Let's take a look at another example. So here I've simply created a new object here, and then I'm actually binding this particular function to this new object. Now again, if you remember the rule, the arrow functions, this always points to this that is part of the current lexical scope. And since I'm binding this function to obj new, this will point to this obj new, and so will the this present inside this particular arrow function. And as for the other console logs, since I'm using new, both these console logs will print this as the new object created using the outer function. Let's run this piece of code, and you can see now the first one points to outer function object, the second and third points to the newly created object because this function is now binded to this new object, and then the outer arrow function actually points to again this that is part of the current lexical scope. So we are done with this video. See you in the next video, guys. I hope this video would have cleared your doubts, and all the best for your interviews. Please like and subscribe.